I'm going to start with you, Cameron.
All right.
And tell us, first of all, a little bit about your background. Who is Cameron? You know, how do you enter this space? And then let's talk about where Intel fits into this space in regards to 5G. You guys are at sort of an interesting spot here, and you can kind of give us a state of the state from where your organization stands in regards to this technology.
Sure, Luke. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Cameron Chehreh, and I'm the Vice President and General Manager for Intel Corporation Public Sector. I come here through a career in operations, but also supporting this customer mission for about 26 years. Recently joined the company as being the CTO for Dell Federal, but I've also worked in the Federal Systems Integrator community. So in my background, it's about supporting programs in the intelligence community, and programs here for Homeland Security. Luke, to the latter part of your question, I think you absolutely hit it. We're at a very interesting inflection point as industry to really help rally to support the mission in a very different way, in a very transformative way, quite frankly, when you think of the intersection of hardware and software. Where we see things going from a 5G perspective is we're starting to see a lot more use cases from a tactical edge. You see edge and cloud being discussed very pervasively today. And if we look at the diverse and brilliant mission that Homeland Security has, there is a lot of edge capability that's required. You know, even at some points, their mission becomes quite complicated, like the DoD. There's disconnected aspects to it. There's all kinds of connectivity issues. So being able to do things more in silicon and hardware at that tactical edge and smaller form factors so you're not encumbering these mission operators and mission users is extremely vital. So as we are developing new capabilities to be able to embed in silicon, we're looking at things like software-defined radio, which does include 5G, so you could take spectrum to a far edge, maybe even low orbit to help with communications in very disadvantaged communications areas. So it's an exciting time, it's a challenging time, but we're on the cusp of something truly unique and different, I think, that the mission hasn't seen in the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, you know, we heard about a lot of different use cases, and it makes you start to think about it when you start thinking about wire speed wirelessly, you start to unlock a lot of potential there, which becomes very interesting. We'll talk about some specific use cases coming up here. Ray, you are the Acting Deputy Assistant Director for Cybercrime Center. I guess two things. One, give us a little bit on your background, right, so people get a perspective of that. And then I'm going to ask you to give us the 101 on Homeland Security investigations first, right, so the audience can get an appreciation for that. And then what is the Cybercrime Center? What do they do, and how do they fit into that overall infrastructure?
I'd be glad to. So again, my name's Ray Shuler. I'm a Deputy Assistant Director for our Cyber and Operational Technology. I've been in law enforcement for 30 years. I started as a state and local officer and then became a federal agent about 20 years ago. My background, I worked a lot of the technical background on cases, doing designated technical equipment, mostly over intercept, phones, mobile devices. The challenge for us in law enforcement, when we do lawful judicial intercepts, usually we have to get a Title III, which is one of the highest forms of a court order. So everything that we do in the technology space has to be logged. It has to be, there has to be a discoverable point of how you got to that entity resolution. So not only do we have to have the technology to be able to have the capability to do it, we also have to have the logging and then the back infrastructure that we can show every step along the way. A little bit about HSI, just as a 101. So we're first and foremost a border security agency. So we investigate the goods and people that traverse the United States border. And we have roughly over 210 field offices domestically here in the United States and over 80 offices overseas. And from a 5G perspective, a large overview where it impacts us the most. Of those 210 field offices, we're in very remote locations. We have a lot of border offices on the southwest border, northern border, remote locations. And the critical infrastructure around the United States and some of those locations, we don't have fiber. There's not business class fiber in all those locations. So we do a lot of transmission of video for collection of evidence. We attack data that's at motion and at rest. So we need the capability of data transfer speeds as fast as possible over a secure network. Just some specific examples of the amount of data that we deal with. Our computer forensic program, which allows us insight on all mobile devices when we get a warrant. Specifically, I'll use child exploitation as a prime example. We did over 6 petabytes of forensic data just last year in our forensic program. Any one of those cases that happened in that 6 petabytes, I can think of one where there were it was 83 terabytes of video on a hard drive, and we have to get that information secure from one location to another. It's a huge challenge for us. And we can't just port the data and the information on a commercial service because, again, we're responsible to the court and we have to show that at the end of that case where we logged and we're accountable for every byte and that it was inherently not changed in any way from point A to point B. Our little profile on our investigation. So child exploitation is one of our number one. We spent 1.2 million agent hours last year in the child exploitation space, arrested over 3,700 offenders, rescued over 800 children, and again, processed over 6 petabytes of forensic data in that space. Transnational narcotics investigations and financial investigations is probably our largest agent hour space in there. There's a lot of evidence and data transversing over that, along with global trade investigations. We also get involved in intellectual property investigations, which that may be technology that we're talking about, that technology being stolen from one company to another, or that technology getting outside of the United States, or being sold on the dark web. We have a cyber crimes profile as well. We get into unlawful intrusion, but primarily in the cyber crime space, we look at the dark net or the dark web. And the dark web market space, we're looking at narcotics being sold over the dark web, child exploitation being proliferated over the dark web, and intellectual property rights.
So a very broad swath of investigative responsibilities there in the Cybercrime Center, specifically into the dark web and child exploitation, et cetera, right? And that's used to sort of leverage across the rest of the country. Is that how that works, right?
Yes, sir. We have a closed network for our computer forensic agents, so they have the ability to exchange data between each other securely, and it's we use a network of both wired and wireless to accomplish that in different methods.
We talk about computing at the edge. A lot of great use cases there. We'll talk about a couple specific ones. Cameron, when I think of Intel, I think of the chips, right? You know, when I think about 5G and compatibility on 5G, and I understand that there's sort of there's 5G light, and then there's 5G medium, and there's 5G ultra. You know, where does Intel fit into that? And give us a specific use case, if you could, of where you all are enabling this type of capability across our partner community.
Sure. It's fine men like this next to me that why we do this, and we're grateful for the people you've caught. I could certainly tell you as a father of 2 daughters, I'm beyond grateful for your mission. Where we play is we're starting to see a really interesting new capability emerge, Luke, and it's all around what we call multi-chip packaging. And what that basically means when you think of it in a mission context, when you think of, call it the DHS agents, not just at the field offices, but think overseas. You're in a disadvantaged comms area, you know your comms are dirty, maybe even adversaries listening in on your comms, and you have to create some sort of secure multi-channel communication back to CONUS in the United States that's using either homomorphic encryption or some form of encryption so that you can always assure chain of custody, because that's really what we're talking about with digital forensic information. A lot of what we're doing is we're tying the security apparatus into the silicon where we know it cannot be tampered with. So we are signing things at the silicon level that we know adversaries cannot inject into any of the code within the silicon, and then we're exposing through very secure APIs the security capabilities into the software and workloads that are riding on that silicon loop. This is what gives us attestation to the data when we talk about data in motion and data at rest. So if you think of it not just with a DHS mission from a law enforcement or investigative, think of FEMA, right? FEMA does a lot when you think of first response for major disasters, but FEMA at times offers support to the intelligence community. Think of the disaster we offered when you think of Haiti. Adversaries never sleep, right? They never, like good politics, we never let a good disaster or crisis go to waste. They're always looking for ways to penetrate our country, both kinetically, physically, and through our cyber apparatus. So being able to create that secure connection tied in the silicon that gives these mission users the assurance that what's happening at the compute level is assured and can hold up the chain of custody. That's really that intersection piece that we see.
That chain of evidence so critical, and the credibility of that evidence in a digital form, sort of a whole new space that, Ray, you've been dealing with for years now. Do you want to give us you kind of painted a very broad picture, a lot of different use cases sprinkled in there. Why don't you give us one that the community here can really appreciate the level of complexity that you're dealing with when you're looking at these cases and the use of this advanced type of technology?
Sure. Probably the hardest space for us to penetrate is within child exploitation in the dark web. There's so much the ability to hide and anonymize on the dark web, and the amount of data that's being thrown around. It makes it a real challenge for us. We use a lot of facial recognition. We have a victim identification lab where sometimes we don't even know who the child is, and we're just starting with an image. So we have to start with that image and be able to work it back. We work with multiple partners to do that, including the Smithsonian. We'll look at an image, and we'll look at everything in the image and try to determine if we can, get a location for that child. That amount of data that's collected, the video, the audio, still images, all of that has to be repositized at a location and then access to that from the field. We're trying to develop tools, government-built tools, that are more attuned to our younger generation of agents and officers. They grew up in a time of working off the phone, solely off the phone, not on a computer like we were. So some of the tools that we're building are solely based off of the phone. I'll give you an example. We have one that uses the camera on any phone. Every identity document now with the Real ID Act has different information that's encoded on that ID. So we can take that, get information from those documents and have a real-time transfer of data, so you're not there with pen and paper or typing in data, just to make it faster for the agents. Along with tools that they can use forensically with the phones to help them out on a search warrant or a scene, just to make it a faster process for the agent on the ground.
Yeah, really trying to operate at machine speed there, no doubt. You got me on the Smithsonian piece. Explain that one. I'm curious about that. I would imagine others are as well.
So just anything that we can identify in a photograph that we could tear it apart to get to a specific location.
Okay,
because
so
let's say you get a
Yeah.
photograph, and all of a sudden that photograph, it could be anywhere in the world. But if there's 3 or 4 things in that photograph that we can identify that, hey, that's this state, that at least takes the whole world, and now we're down to a state, and we can kind of start from there.
Interesting way to unpack that. Cameron, let's talk about gaps in regards to capability gaps that are still there right now. We're just launching this type of capability, right? 5G is really not that old. We hear folks talking about 6G and 10G and everything else. And I know that the experts are saying, look, we're just trying to get down to nice tight versions of 5G and get that out there so it's nice and compatible. Let's talk about the gaps that you are seeing right now that you're trying to address to make sure that there's some some good capability out there that's reliable, dependable, et cetera.
Yeah, a lot of the gaps, Luke, are interesting. Most of them you'll find are not technical, but more cultural and how we operationalize the technology. Really, the innovation behind 5G is moving from a proprietary to more of an open standard software-based solution, right? There's some brilliant things that all of our partners in the ecosystem are doing, especially with AT&T and a few others, to really drive that. And it's changing the entire architecture of how we do communications networks. Because with 5G, we now have the opportunity to really have these as almost portable cloud nodes in base stations, around buildings. You could take them tactical into the field in any type of capacity. So the gaps are really around being able to maximize the benefit of the software-defined nature of 5G, create those next generation workloads like Ray talked about, and then be able to really use them for the biggest exploitive advantage for the mission. And I think that's the hard part that people are trying to kind of wrap their heads around, right? Because that architecture breaks a lot of the traditional cultural norms and policy norms that we have. We talked about chain of custody, data in motion, data at rest. When you think of a federated architecture and having to check pedigree and provenance of data, it becomes extraordinarily more difficult in this type of 5G realm. But it also becomes easier because I can leverage technology, speed of chip and processing, and the software to help me engage that provenance and assure it throughout the entire life cycle. So it's really a change in thinking in those gaps. From a capability perspective, I would also offer you too, it's changing the dynamic of how we deploy technology into the field. Most people are traditionally accustomed to engaging with your OEM providers, whether it's a Dell or an HPE or whoever. Now, being able to embed silicon into actual kinetic platforms and manage that is a very different motion. Being able to actually 5G enable a vehicle at the vehicle level, and then how do you secure and harden that the same way you would an enterprise class, say flight case or something of that nature. So there are gaps that we're going to have to close in policy, in culture, and in our processes, I think more than anything technical.
Interesting twist there, Ray. Different perspective here, just operationally as you're looking at different types of capabilities and you're looking at functionality. I'm sure there's gaps, right? Hey, we can get it to the 2-yard line, but we really need to get it over into the end zone, so to speak. From that perspective, I mean, where are the gaps that you see right now that are sort of, more immediate type of situations that you're trying to look for the community to solve for you?
So that's a great question. That ties exactly into what you just said. So you made the parallel that it's almost you're creating a mini cloud. So the amount of data that we're having to deal with, like even at an individual case level, there's just large buckets of data there of evidence.
How much? Just give us some perspective for
our
whatever type of case.
So for child exploitation, I use the computer forensic example of over 6 petabytes of data. I mean, that's just a
one case.
A lot of data. No, that was a combined. That was combined
wow.
for that. But I mean, we've seen hundreds and hundreds of terabytes.
Sure.
And how that, back to the cloud example, how that becomes difficult for us. So our case management system, and for any law enforcement, case management. Mm-hmm. So when I started 30 years ago, we'd come into court with banker box after banker box after banker box of paper and just reams and reams of paper for a trial that's all subject to a discovery process. Now our case management system is all electronic. Everything's digitized. All the evidence, whether we get evidence from a Ring doorbell camera or we get evidence from an audio clip or wherever it is, that all has to be retained for criminal evidence. And that all goes into our case management system. So like you were saying with the cloud, some of these cases get to be so large that we almost have to have a mini cloud for that case because the prosecutor gets a copy of it, you have the original evidence, and then there's a discovery process where the defense also has to have access to that information for a period of time. So there's a lot of information sharing, and then that information has to be secure, and it's very large buckets of data.
a lot of information that is available and a lot of information that has to be shared amongst those three entities. So you really, I guess that's a triplicate type of environment. So incredible amount of storage alone and being able to move that back and forth. And again, have the chain of evidence, I'm sure is daunting. Let's talk about lessons learned. I'm going to start with you, Ray. You're really pushing the envelope on a lot of these capabilities because you have to, right? I mean, the reality is you're collecting all this digital information. It's now available. You have to maintain the same standards as you've had when it was back in a paper environment. What are the lessons learned as you're adopting this type of technology, trying to use it, figuring out what's working, what isn't? You certainly don't want to figure that out when you're standing in front of a judge. You know, what's give us some examples of what you're discovering there.
Sure. So for us, number one lesson learned over the past 10 years is data normalization. So the more standard that we can keep our data, or the fewer the formats that we can keep our data in, the easier it is for us to transport that data to someone else, whether it's a prosecutor or a fellow law enforcement officer or a foreign partner. So the ability for industry to provide us data in a standard format is also very important to us, because that's 2 or 3 steps that we don't have to take to get that data in. So that's probably lesson one. And lesson two is the example I used of looking at your younger workforce and providing them tools that are more in tune to how they learn. The example: working off of a phone opposed to working off of a laptop computer in the field.
Right, and I would just say, just in context, the things you're describing here are not just the Cybercrime Center, right? This is every investigator across the planet Earth, right? Because you've got them in all the embassies and certainly across all of the U.S. Cameron, over to you. Let's talk about lessons learned. What are you seeing? What are you discovering? What are you encountering when you're looking at adopting this type of technology and having your customers adopt this type of technology?
Yeah, I'm going to compliment a couple of things that Ray said, because I think they're very powerful. First, change configuration management, which typically falls under an IT realm. Luke, I would offer you that we all need to cognizantly wake up a little bit and recognize there's no lines between IT and mission anymore, right? All of these platforms that the mission used to enable execution of it, they're all digitally enabled in some capacity, even if you come down to GPS and G-cars determining how to get to a situation or a crime scene, right? So change configuration management is vital. I've been a professional witness in the past, and it's fascinating to get crucified on the stand because you were one dot release off in your software that you use to analyze the forensic data rather than the dot release that the forensic data was stored in. So this is the type of precarious situation that Ray's talking about, that we all have to be members in that solution and that fight for law enforcement. So change configuration management is critical. We cannot accept these block step upgrades like we've traditionally accepted in the past in government. We have to be very bold and brave in breaking glass and getting exponentially more innovative in the capability that we deploy to the field. Because guess what? The technology's ready now, right? We've been talking about this in the mission space for a while to enable mission operators tools at their fingertips, at their edge, the way they operate. And we now have that opportunity, and so we have to change our thinking on the back office. I think the second thing is going to be all centered around data integrity at the software layer. Right, being able to do that is a very different thing than the traditional thinking we used to have, where we would have databases, data pools, data lakes, data harbors. To your point, Luke, I would offer you, my former company would love to sell you 3 and 4 and 5 times the storage to be able to duplicate this data. It's not about data duplication, it's about digital certification and being able to have assurance in that digital certification that you issue to those constituents that need access to that data. Very much like what we do in the intelligence community, and you can create now these communities of interest to access this data and information. And I think there's going to be a focus. Lesson learned 3 is really all about metadata, because sometimes the metadata is more vitally important than the actual seed data itself. And it's the metadata you're securing. You talked about the photograph analogy before. We do a lot of that in the intelligence community, just looking at things in the photograph and the attributes. That sometimes is more important than the photograph itself. So we have to make sure as we develop solutions moving forward, we are focusing on that, enriching that in a standard format that's digestible, and being able to make more calculated decisions using artificial intelligence so that when we ask those 100 dumb questions to get to the one smart one, we can process through those faster. I think that's the real lesson learned.
Ray, let's talk about priorities and sort of in two dimensions. One, let's talk about what are the priorities of HSI sort of for this year? As you lay down this year, you're looking out into the next, let's say, 12 months. And then maybe take that to the next step and say, okay, what are the priorities of the Cyber Center as well?
Sure, and that's easy. It's kind
Maybe
of
they're the same, maybe they're not.
They
Yeah.
are the same. So our director put out the priorities for us for cyber investigations and financial. And almost there's no line now between the two, because now we've gone into a digital age of currency with cryptocurrency, with all its different types that are out there. It's easier for criminals to anonymize their footprint, just much in the same way as the dark web's used to hide their location and their capability. With the Cyber Crime Center, we have both of those profiles there, our cryptocurrency analysis, and as well as our cyber group. The cyber group primarily deals with dark web marketplaces, whether it's drugs, child exploitation, or intellectual property. They work a little bit in the cyber intrusion space and ransomware. One other thing we didn't talk about earlier that's a huge challenge for us is malware. And when you get into that dark web space, you're basically walking into a dangerous environment, because any piece of evidence that we take in at any point, there could be something in that could get away from us and be damaging to not only the device that we're trying to gain evidence from, but the device that we use to try to extract that as well.
Cameron, how about from your perspective, priorities? What's the demand signal that you're seeing right now that you're trying to address?
You know, for me, Luke, this is kind of an exciting time, because in your opening salvo, I know when I joined Intel, I thought it was really about just computer chips, right? When I see the world ahead of us with regards to silicon, it's everywhere. It's in every aspect of our life and everything that we're doing. When I see the demand signal moving forward, it changes the conversation from what I think we've been talking about the last 20 years, where IT and compute is really all just commodity. I think what we're vastly realizing in every aspect of our life is it's becoming more of an integrated, we've consumerized it now, and now we understand how to leverage digital capability to our advantage. I'm extraordinarily excited about the future and the demand signal, because we're seeing opportunity to rebalance the global supply chain, first of all, so that we can mitigate risk not only for our country, but allied nations and others. And given the current geopolitical environment, I think that's very, very important. The second thing I'm extraordinarily excited about is bringing domestic fabrication back to the United States and bolster our security posture through that. Because I think what we're seeing there from a demand signal is the need and the demand for silicon is not decreasing by any stretch. It is exponentially growing, with everything becoming smarter, phones, appliances, cars, even people, and the work that's happening in robotics, right? All these different things. So I'm excited that it's getting embedded further in to truly enable and improve the quality of human life. And the fact that we're getting an opportunity to rebalance things globally and really create a more assured platform in the United States, frankly, Luke, excites the hell out of me.
And I'm glad that you're excited, and I'm sure that Ray is as well. Let's talk about sort of more on the ground. When we think about some of the stuff we saw in this opening video and these slides, and some of the capability that can potentially be unlocked when you have this, again, I'll call it wire speed, wirelessly enabled. I'm thinking about, you all out in your G-Rides or out in these remote locations that you're describing, et cetera. What kind of capability gets enabled once you have that type of capability at your, sort of in the palm of your hand? What things get unlocked when you can use, different types of devices in that kind of a way?
That's a great question. So when you get up into 5G speeds, particularly if we get to the point where the rural environments are going to have 5G speeds, well, it opens up much higher resolution video for us, everything from surveillance to whatever you can imagine from whatever device. The better the quality of evidence, the more that we can extract out of that. The better the quality that facial recognition would be, the higher the resolution of the video, the better the quality of the audio. It's the better data speeds that we have, just a much higher quality of evidence comes across, and we don't have to worry about loss or explaining an interrupt in a video where there's no connection, from an officer safety standpoint, it allows protection of the officers. So there's full coverage, they have the communications, there's no gaps.
So if we could just kind of baseline that, how big of a deal is that today? The fact that you have that at sort of a limited capability. You certainly have it in the, let's say that we'll call it the NFL cities. As soon as you get outside of that, of which you all are very much on the border, you lose that capability. How big of a deal is that these days for you to have to sort of work around that all the time?
So it is. It's a huge deal because the one common element that almost every criminal has is their communication device. And now we have phones that we're encountering that have an entire terabyte, just 1 terabyte. So someone can walk around with their entire life in their hand, and their entire banking infrastructure, everything. So that's, as a criminal investigator, that's like a great repository. But at the same time, it creates the greatest challenge we've ever had with encryption, and the level that encryption is right now. It's a huge challenge. It's a blessing and a curse.
Let's talk about barriers. I'm going to start with you, Cameron. Where do you see the barriers in regards to introducing this technology, unlocking all these capabilities? What do you see out there in regards to the things that are blocking this from happening as rapidly as potentially it could?
Yeah, this one, Luke, in prep for this, I had to really think about it. I think I would boil it down to the age-old challenge we all face in public sector, which is policy issues. And I'll give you a very prescriptive example. Today, we have the capability to deploy not only with our law enforcement officers, but our military warfighters, drone swarms that can protect the life of the warfighter or the life of the law enforcement agent while they're out in theater doing things. These swarms can have the high-definition cameras, and at the speed of processing can process friend or foe on facial recognition if you're out in a disadvantaged area or very tumultuous zone or whatever the case may be. And you even have it to the point where the drone can sacrifice itself on behalf of the human to preserve the human life. This all exists today in a lot of the IS&T shops. There are beta tests going on in a lot of different areas, but when you think of the policy aspects of it, we're getting a little bit into this whole Terminator-esque kind of situation, Luke, where people are, rightfully so, having to digest the fact that I've got this human-to-machine interaction, and notice I've couched human first, because it's always got to have the human in the loop, but I have opportunities to use AI, robotics, the blend of those two together to preserve human life rather than the other offensive aspects we need to look at. So I think it's policy at this point. The technology's there, and in my mind, we have to adopt quicker because our near peers and our adversaries are adopting these things more quickly than we are. But we have to do it and preserve what makes our country great, which is our Constitution, right? And that's why the healthy debate is good. But I think we have to have these policy debates faster. And I think for policymakers, we need to put temporal stakes in the ground on when to get decisions done by. We can't let these cans get kicked down the road. There's a lot happening in the world right now. We have all seen, and we've only seen this once every generation. We have the technology now to preserve American life. We have the technology to help improve it. I think it's the policies have to catch up a little faster and start moving at the pace of innovation.
Ray, I'm going to springboard off of that and not so much put you on the spot, but before we get into barriers of, the classic type of stuff, which, there's acquisition cycles and there's budget and all those sort of things, which I definitely want to hear that perspective. I'm sure everybody does. But in regards to what Cameron's describing, how much do you all face these days where you're in this sort of arms war, if you will, from a technology standpoint, trying to keep up with what the bad guys are using and what you're using to try to catch them or investigate them or monitor them or, that type of thing? How often are you finding yourself in that situation these days?
Oh, every day, and I'll use the exact example that you did, but I'll put it from a legal perspective. So a lot of people here in the communication industry, and the laws that we use, the CALIA Act, the Communication Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, was developed in the 80s. So that law in the 80s that gives us the ability to do a lot of the things that we need to do, maybe it's time for an update in that law because it really doesn't address the things like encryption and data. So that's the challenge we face every day, policy, but then also keeping the law update that allows us to be able to operate that we need to in this new digital environment.
Barriers. Well, what do you see as the barriers as when you identify some technology that you want to use? You brought it into the lab. Maybe S&T has introduced it. We have S&T here with us today. And you want to get it implemented. What are the barriers there? Is it just getting it inserted into the technology frame? Is it acquiring it? Is it budget? Is it all of the above?
So it's all of the above, and I think we've all seen this over the past 3 or 4 years. The acquisition cycle. So budgets are not coming on a federal October 1st as they have been in the past. So when we get a budget midway through the year, it really puts the constraints on the acquisition cycle to where we have to be able to move extremely fast. We're only going to be able to function in that environment if we have strategic sourcing initiatives that allow us to move at the speed of mission, so we can get those acquisitions in within the guidelines and the regulations, make sure that we meet all the policy, but we do that in a very short amount of time.
And, have those strategic sourcing capabilities sort of bench ready, if you will.
Yes, sir.
From that perspective, I think very important. Let's talk about not really your wish list, but let's talk about some of the things that you want to sort of dose this audience with, if you will, in regards to, hey, here's where I see the gaps in regards to the things that we need and the things that we want to make sure this community is paying attention to address your emerging needs and concerns that are over the horizon, around the corner, not in the petri dish kind of stuff, but stuff that are things that need to be addressed in the not so distant future.
So I would say number one would be back to infrastructure. So with all the environments that we work in, we need the fastest speed that we can possibly get in the agent on the ground's hand, regardless of the environment, whether that's in New Mexico or if it's in New York City or it's in a remote location in the desert. We need that fast speed at that location. Particularly, there's a lot more risk in that rough environment to lose evidence or to not gain that data. So we need that speed capability that are in the larger market cities to be in these rural environments. I would say that would be my number one wish list. Number two would be combating encryption. How can we as law enforcement, when we have a legal process to do so and it's judicially mandated that we can get access to data, sometimes we can't even access that data because there's no means to combat that encryption, or let's say that servers outside the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. It makes it very difficult for us we're definitely not going to attack it at rest where it resides, but also attack that data in motion to get it in that cycle. So encryption and critical infrastructure for data speeds, that would be my number two, 1 and 2 wish list.
Got it. Cameron, what are you hearing in regards to what the community is asking you to be addressing in the not too distant future?
Honestly, Luke, it is give the mission the same power in their hands that we have the luxury of as consumers. I think the things that we walk around with in a smartphone, again, align policy, acquisition, budget, and the capability to give us a simple, seamless way to integrate technology into that environment. everyone is working extraordinarily hard, Luke, to be able to do that. But we have to think of that team of teams model, right? The General McChrystal model of how we do that to swarm around the mission user and understand how to empower and enable them technically with the capabilities in either hand at the speed of mission relevance. That's the real key. And for me, my wish list would be able to do that for them as fast as we possibly can.
Plug and play at the speed of mission. Megan's got some questions that have come in. Fire away.
I do, and a great discussion so far. And I encourage folks, if anyone here has a question, feel free to let me know. We will certainly get to you, so raise your hand. I'll keep an eye out. But I think our first question from our online audience, it's pretty straightforward, but people were just curious, when you're working in a remote location where there's no wireless service, do you bring in your own cell on wheels, or do you ask for help from a mobile network operator?
Question. So we have a lot of different capabilities. We have mobile command centers that can set up their own mesh networks. We use a lot of RF to be able to transport data. And all of that is really good, and it's functional, and it passes our mission, but it's still not at what's available at business class fiber and 5G speeds. It's what we have to operate in that space is still not at where the latest technology is, because we just don't have that technology in the remote environment.
So you make do with what you have.
We do.
And with all due respect to the providers that are providing that, we really appreciate it. On a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being, you're fully optimized, where do you think that capability stands right now in those remote locations?
Oh, it's fully functional. I would say it was 7 to 8.
Okay, well, that's not too bad.
It's not too bad, but it's still not,
But you need to operate
we have to operate at the
10.
absolute top. Yes,
Gotcha.
sir.
Okay.
All right, another question, unless you've got folks here. But another question that came in, and Luke, feel free to embellish if you'd like, but Cameron, you had mentioned federated architecture, how it has both sort of advantages and disadvantages, but what should we be thinking about when it comes to security?
Yeah, security is really critical in that as we move to this federated or disaggregated architecture, as some people refer to it, again, it really drives the importance of what you're computing on. So you have to make sure your encryption, your security ties to the most assured piece of the platform that you have at your hands, which is the silicon. Because we know that is the piece that can't be exploited unless you're physically there or even tampering with silicon itself. And that, as we know, most adversaries can't do unless they're nation state sponsored. So I think it's vitally important to understand we have to draw things out of this commodity state and commodity conversation and leverage the capabilities that exist today, because it is a true balanced marriage between security and silicon and security and software working together to bring what the mission really needs from that perspective.
And then we also got a couple questions about some of the activities going on within the ICE Innovation Lab. And I know, Mr. Shuler, you alluded to some of that work going on, but just curious if there's anything that particularly excites you about what's happening over there.
Yeah, what's cooking in the Innovation Lab these days? And where does that fit into the HSI sort of portfolio, I think would be helpful for the community?
So that's a great question. So the premise of the Innovation Lab is, instead of having data out there siloed in all these different locations, law enforcement uses several different tools, and we use different applications, and usually our data it's spread out over multiple different buckets. We're trying to bring all of our data into one location, and that's the foundation of the lab. And then to build tools around that data, getting back to what I was talking about for normalization. So we have some exciting tools that we're getting out to the agents right now that are familiar to them. They work on mobile devices. They're very intuitive to use. There's a very low learning time from the first time they see it to getting up on it, because it's something familiar that they've seen in the past. So there's a lot of work being done in that space. It's very exciting.
And I think that's it for questions. So, Luke, I will let you wrap things up for us.
Sure. Let me ask an overarching question. If we could sort of fast forward, if you will, and look, let's say 3 years out. I don't like to get too far out there. What is your expectation? What is your goal, Ray, in respect to what you'd like to see? If somebody's agent coming in from the field, they're coming into the Cybercrime Center, what type of capability are you shooting for to have available to them at their fingertips at that point in time?
No, that's a great question. So by that point in 3 years, I hope we will be predominantly working off of the phones. I think that will be to be less dependent on larger hardware that we have to drag in the field. The more that we can scale that down and to keep that size down on everything, for every investigative tool that we use. If we can get that all on the phone in 3 years, I think that will be a huge task for our agents. The other thing, again, would be the infrastructure. Hopefully in the 3 years from now, we'll have that speed at all those locations throughout the United States, at least domestically. Maybe a little bit maritime as well, that we will be able to not have to worry so much about that data transfer rate, that it will be there, from the most remote section of the United States to the most populated.
Cameron, what are you all gearing up and focusing on to make sure is available in 3 years?
There's a whole bunch of fun things in the works, Luke. The thing I would offer to you that I probably talk to you safely is extending the capability beyond Silicon using software. We have to use software to get exponential speed in the market. So being able to embed the 5G capability into anything, anywhere, anytime. I envision a day where if hopefully you have a mission user that needs bandwidth, let's say they're out in the middle of nowhere, right? Be able to throw up a portable drone that they can operate, give them the speeds they need because it could connect to a low Earth orbit satellite to get the relay that they need with the bandwidth they need, operate at some sort of capacity, and then be able to pull the drone down and continue to move on. It is about getting capability in the mission user's hands as fast as we can. And I think that's the real key. I think the second thing is it's got to be about higher assurance of the platforms, being able to rebalance the global supply chain just to get capability in people's hands. I think this chip shortage has taught all of us that silicon's become very important, right? People are waiting 18 to 24 months to get their new Teslas because they're all sitting in parking lots waiting for chips or Fords or whatever you drive. So being able to get this shortage behind us, deliver faster, rapid, more relevant capability at the speed of mission, that's where we're focused.
Ray, I'm going to give you the opportunity to give your final thoughts here and just wrap us up if you would.
No, thank you. One thing I didn't mention was about COVID and how it impacted us in law enforcement. So for HSI, we had a large investigative footprint into that because everything was coming into the United States. But on the other side of that, it also impacted us on our acquisition cycle. So we had all the technology that we use, we had the same problems that the consumers did. We weren't able to get the equipment because of the chip shortage. And, my hope is now that we're on the tail end of that we're going to have a speedy recovery and things are going to slowly start get back to normal now.
And I think a lessons learned, as I think Cameron was describing there, that we recognize there's some things that we're just going to have to make sure that good old USA has the capability to manufacture and produce so that we can make sure those things are available and do all the important things that you and the rest of your community is doing. On behalf of all of us, we want to thank you all for everything that you're doing and the partner community out there. We really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Today's program was produced by the Homeland Security and Defense Forum and made possible by the support of our partners AT&T, Dell Technologies, Ericsson, and Intel. Video of today's show and other HSDF original programs can be found on the HSDF YouTube channel. Subscribe today and enjoy hours of insightful policy discussions. Stay tuned for information on additional HSDF symposiums in 2022, including the Evolution of Federal Cybersecurity on June 22nd and the HSDF Hybrid Cloud Symposium in September. For more information, visit www.hsdf.org.